I think this is a really interesting area because when we think about strategies to create network effects, there are two kind of broad categories that we think about: user aggregation power and platform utility power, and they're very much intertwined. How we use these concepts explicitly within TDM to assess network effects and then to assess strategies about how we can make them stronger is a really simple matrix. On the horizontal axis, we've got user aggregation power. On the vertical axis, we've got platform utility power. And we literally plot the companies that we are investing in or we're invested in on that matrix to get an understanding and really a subjective assessment of how strong is their network effect. And the idea is that we want our companies to move up and to the right.
And so if you were to put that in layman's terms, the aggregation power?
Yeah, so user aggregation power, whether it's a direct network or a two-sided network, is very much around how good a job has the network done at aggregating potential users of that network. So if you take Facebook, for example, they've done an incredible job of aggregating the world's population as part of their social network.
And what about utility power?
So platform utility power is related but also separate to this idea of user aggregation. Platform utility power is derived from user aggregation, but it can also be independent of user aggregation. It's this idea of how much utility does every user of the platform get from using the platform.
Yeah. So using this framework, and I think it will become more apparent as we go through each network effect, how would you assess a direct network and the power of that?
So perhaps it's best to use a real life example. So WhatsApp, an example of a direct network that has done an incredible job of user aggregation. So certainly over 1 billion daily users of WhatsApp. Despite the fact that there were many messaging platforms available for many people to use as that business grew, but that user base grew very rapidly. So incredible job on the user aggregation side of things, but where they've done, I think, an exceptional job is around platform utility to those users, even independent of the fact that the user base has grown significantly. So you think about some of the features and functionality that WhatsApp have layered into to their messaging platform that distinguishes it from iMessaging as an example. So they've built platform utility independent of just the user aggregation, but the user aggregation has also been incredibly powerful.
Yeah, so if you're assessing the network effect, high user aggregation, high utility of the platform, very powerful network effect.
Absolutely.
So moving on to the next network effect, two-sided network. Let's apply this framework.
Yeah, so I mean the framework applies in exactly the same way. The thing we distinguish here is that we really focus on both user aggregation on the demand side and the supply side. We think about platform utility to both the demand side and the supply side. But what do we really care about the most in terms of assessing the strength? It's the demand side. We're trying to optimize for demand side user aggregation and platform utility because we've found that over time, if that is optimized, the supply side will come.
Yeah, and the supply side will not only get sucked in, but when you think of aggregating the supply, it actually doesn't create a network effect in itself. It just probably lowers your cost of doing business.
Absolutely. And the supply side are always want to get access to the demand side. So the more you can build that demand side, and we've seen a whole bunch of two-sided network effects that have just built the demand side many years before they even plugged the supply side in.
And so, well, I think we're now getting the idea of the framework, but to a hybrid network effect.
So the strength of the hybrid network effect is really just the combination of both of those things that we talked about. And classically, they do start out as direct network effects first, and then they plug in the supply side. Social networks being a great example. So, and I think Facebook's a kind of interesting example where they built that demand side, that social network at massive scale, and then slowly monetized with advertising over time, to the point now where you'd say it's
Diminishing utility almost.
diminishing utility to the demand side, given the amount of supply side advertising.
Yeah. So I think this is a great point in time to maybe map out how different businesses have used this and this kind of framework to not only assess their network effects, but to strengthen them and to be more powerful over time, and a few of the strategies that they've put in place to do that.
So to use an example of a company that is way up there in the right-hand quadrant is Google.
Probably the highest, really.
Yeah, probably it'd certainly have to be one of the highest, where they've done an incredible job around user aggregation. And that's probably what that is what they optimized for in the early days. So they were high on the vertical access, being platform utility to users. And then over time, as user aggregation increased, they moved up and to the right to where they are now, which is they've done an awesome job on user aggregation and platform utility.
And so another example that is interesting, because that kind of is up and to the right and has been for a long time, but let's map the journey maybe of something like a Netflix. Netflix 2011, let's start there.
So Netflix 2011, it's an interesting one because it's one of those examples where it's a business model that is dependent on that minimum viable supply of content. And back in 2011, very much dependent on the supply of content from the big content creators.
Yeah.
Having said that, they've done an awesome job in terms of user aggregation. It was early on in their streaming business, but they were still doing an awesome job of aggregating users around this amazing streaming experience that they were starting to deliver back in those days.
So not only was streaming new, but it was this wonderful user experience that people flocked to because of the ability to watch anything on demand, but also in this wonderful interface.
Exactly. So you think about the platform they were delivering independent of supply. So back in the DVD days, they had the same supply of content, but they had this transformational platform utility event of streaming video, which helped them move up and to the right. So independent of user aggregation, but it also propelled user aggregation.
Let's fast forward to 2020, because they have moved up and to the right, and there's been a step change in that business. And I know where you're going to take this, but what has caused that?
So what was the other transformational thing they did?
Original content.
Original content. So again, they created more platform utility independent of supply by creating their own proprietary content on the platform. And so what that does is deliver more platform utility to the users, to the Netflix customers, and moves them up and to the right, delivers more platform utility, delivers more user aggregation, the network effect, and that flywheel just keeps spinning faster and faster.
Great example, and probably my favorite. One similar to that is Spotify, and I guess that's probably worth talking to as well.
Yeah, so Spotify, it's a really similar example in that started off with the minimum viable supply of content, but you think about what they're doing around podcasts at the moment. In the last 12 months, they've invested many, many hundreds of millions of dollars in proprietary podcast content that you're not going to be able to get on other podcast platforms. So they're now delivering more platform utility independent of the supply of music and other podcasts on their platform that you just can't get in the Apple Podcast app anymore, for example.
Great example. So we've talked about two businesses that are moving up and to the right, and maybe an example of somewhere that has diminishing platform utility. We touched on it earlier, but it's probably worth elaborating on this one.
Yeah, I mean, this could be a controversial example, Facebook. So clearly they've done an amazing job building user aggregation on the Facebook platform. I mean, billions of users globally, awesome job. And they have done a really good job over the years of delivering platform utility in a whole range of different ways. But our personal in-house view of where Facebook has gone wrong is the supply of advertising has really saturated the Facebook user experience on the demand side to the point where we think it turns into diminishing platform utility for demand side users. There's just too much advertising that isn't relevant for users, in our opinion.
Yeah, so to put this in layman's term, the reason why I use Facebook in the first place was to connect with my friends. The more friends I had, the better the experience. They started serving up a few ads. It became interesting because the algorithm knows what I like. But all of a sudden, I don't get to see my friends and what they're doing. And as each one leaves, my utility is diminished.
Exactly. And so that's our personal view. And that's one of the tricky things with that type of business model, where you do have the two sides of the networks collide, and you potentially get diminishing returns to one side or the other.